The weakest link emerges. In the vast expanse of space, where countless battles raged between powerful alien fleets, there existed a ship so weak, so outdated, that it was laughed at by its allies and enemies alike. This ship, known as the Fallen Star, was the last of its kind. Its engines were sluggish, its weapons barely functional, and its armor had long ago been worn down by years of neglect. It was a relic, abandoned in the back of the fleet, forgotten by those who once relied on it. The crew aboard the Fallen Star was a ragtag group, mostly humans who had somehow managed to survive the chaos of the war. They had no glory, no honor, and no hope of ever turning the tide of battle. They were considered expendable, a footnote in the history of the war that was far too big for them. The fleet commanders had already written the ship off, and no one paid attention to it. It was a ghost ship, barely holding together, drifting among the stars as the rest of the fleet charged ahead into battle. But there was one thing the humans on board the Fallen Star had that no one else did: determination. A young engineer named Captain Lisa Harper was the one who refused to give up. She had been assigned to the Fallen Star after a series of unfortunate events left her with little choice. She could have joined one of the more prestigious ships, those with shiny new technology and battle-tested crews, but she chose to stay. She saw something in the ship that no one else did, a potential for greatness that others had overlooked. She was determined to make the ship something more than just a symbol of failure. For months, Harper worked in secret, running her team ragged as they scoured the ship for any sign of usable parts. The ship's systems were outdated, but with enough effort, they could be patched together, improved, and made stronger. Harper believed that if she could bring the Fallen Star back to life, it could be turned into the most dangerous ship in the fleet. The ship may have been weak, but it still had a core, and she was going to make sure that core became something no one would ever forget. The first step was repairing the ship's engines. They were ancient, almost unusable, but with human ingenuity, they could be upgraded. Harper knew that without a functional engine, the ship would be nothing more than a floating target, but with a good engine, it could move like a predator in the dark. Late nights were spent reworking the old systems, scavenging parts from other ships, and using technology the humans had developed over years of conflict. It was a dangerous game, playing with ancient tech, but Harper's team was skilled, and they had no other choice. If they failed, the Fallen Star would be lost forever. But the ship's core was only part of the problem. The real challenge lay in its weaponry. The weapons aboard the Fallen Star were old, weak, and ineffective. They had barely any power to repel an enemy, let alone engage in a full-scale battle. Harper knew they needed more than just basic upgrades. They needed something revolutionary, something that could turn the ship into a nightmare for anyone who dared to stand against it. At night, as the crew slept, Harper worked tirelessly with her closest team members to design a new weapon system. It would need to be compact yet powerful, efficient yet deadly. She knew the risks. The weapons could backfire, causing catastrophic damage to the ship, but she had no other choice. The fate of the Fallen Star, and the humans aboard it, depended on success. If they succeeded, they would have the means to fight back, to prove that humans were not weak, that they could rise up and strike fear into their enemies. One evening, as the team gathered to test the new system, the first hint of something extraordinary occurred. The ship's core hummed with a deep, resonant power, something beyond what the engineers had predicted. It wasn't just a weapon. It was a force. The ship vibrated as if it was waking up from a long slumber, responding to the new energy coursing through its systems. At first, Harper and her team were unsure if the new system was stable. The readings were all over the place, and alarms blared as the ship's old systems tried to compensate for the sudden surge of power. But then something amazing happened. The power settled, the systems synchronized, and the weapons came online. Harper's heart raced as she realized they had succeeded. The weak ship had transformed. It was no longer a forgotten relic, no longer the weakest ship in the fleet. The Fallen Star was now a ship with potential. It wasn't perfect, not yet, But it was something no one had ever expected. The ship was alive with new energy, and its weapons were ready. But the most important thing of all was that the humans aboard it had done what no one else believed possible. They had turned the weakest link in the fleet into something to be reckoned with. As the crew gathered around to witness the first test of the upgraded ship, the reality began to sink in. They weren't just surviving anymore. They had created something powerful, something capable of taking on the might of the entire fleet. The weakest ship in the fleet had become a weapon of unimaginable power. The war was far from over, and many battles lay ahead. But in that moment, Harper and her crew knew one thing for certain. The fallen star was no longer just a symbol of failure. It was a nightmare waiting to be unleashed. The upgrade begins. With the fallen star now a force to be reckoned with, the crew had no time to waste. The battle ahead was too important, and they were running out of time. Harper and her team of engineers, now working around the clock, knew that the ship's transformation had just begun. The ship's core was stronger, the weapons had been reactivated, but there was still so much to do. The old systems were barely holding together, and new parts were hard to come by. Harper made a bold decision. She would need to take the ship deeper into enemy territory to gather resources. It was risky, but it was their only option. The fleet would never send reinforcements, not for the fallen star, but they could find what they needed on their own. They needed more advanced technology, and the only way to get it was to steal it from the heart of the enemy's forces. As the crew prepared for their daring mission, the tension was palpable. Many of them had doubts. How could they survive behind enemy lines? How could they possibly pull off such a dangerous operation? But Harper refused to let fear control them. She believed in the ship, and she believed in her crew. This was their chance to prove that the humans could rise above the challenges, that they weren't just survivors but conquerors. The ship's engines had been upgraded just enough to make this mission possible. It was a gamble, but it paid off. As the fallen star slipped into enemy territory, the crew held their breath, knowing that any wrong move could spell disaster. The ship, now faster and more responsive than ever, moved like a shadow, unnoticed by enemy sensors. The newly installed stealth technology worked wonders, allowing them to navigate through enemy patrols with ease. However, danger lurked around every corner. Their first stop was an abandoned space station on the edge of enemy-controlled space. This was where they would find the high-tech parts they needed to continue their upgrades. But even the quiet, dark space station wasn't safe. It had once been a thriving hub, but now it was a ghost town. Every corner held the potential for an ambush. The crew moved cautiously, knowing they couldn't afford to make a sound. Every footstep, every breath, felt amplified in the cold, empty silence. They scavenged quickly, grabbing parts from old defense systems and power generators. But as they began to leave, the station's emergency alarms blared to life. The enemy had discovered their presence. Harper's heart raced as she gave the order to retreat. The crew ran back to the fallen star, and as they took off, the enemy ships appeared in the distance, closing in fast. It was a close call, but the upgrades to the ship's engines allowed them to outrun their pursuers just long enough to escape. But this was only the beginning. The crew knew they would need to do this again, and again, if they were going to fully upgrade the ship. Back on the fallen star, the engineers worked day and night, installing the new tech into the ship's systems. They improved the weapon systems, adding more firepower to its already deadly arsenal. They also began upgrading the ship's shields, which were once barely able to hold up against even light enemy fire. Now they had become much stronger, able to absorb much heavier blows without faltering. The ship was becoming an unstoppable force, piece by piece. But despite the progress, Harper knew that there were still risks. Each upgrade, each change to the ship's systems, brought with it the potential for something to go wrong. The systems were ancient, and the more they tinkered with them, the more unstable they became. There was always the fear that one wrong move could cause a catastrophic failure. Yet, Harper refused to stop. She had made a promise to herself to the crew that she would not allow the fallen star to remain the weakest ship in the fleet. The ship had the potential to be so much more. It could turn the tide of war. It could bring the humans the victory they so desperately needed. They were on the brink of something big. As the upgrades continued, the crew began to notice something strange happening to the ship. It wasn't just the new tech or the better systems. There was something about the ship itself. It felt different, alive even. The hum of the engines had changed. The systems seemed to respond to the crew almost intuitively, as if they were no longer operating on cold logic, but on something more, something human. It was as though the ship was becoming more than just a machine. It was becoming a partner, a weapon that understood the people using it. Harper couldn't explain it, but she couldn't ignore it either. Every test, every new improvement, only seemed to reinforce the strange connection between the ship and its crew. The ship was no longer just the fallen star. It was becoming something new, something powerful, something that would soon make every enemy fleet tremble in fear. The weakest link in the fleet had been transformed, and it was only a matter of time before the rest of the galaxy would know its name. But even as Harper marveled at the ship's progress, she knew they were not yet ready for the final battle. More upgrades were needed, and soon they would face their ultimate test. Would the fallen star truly become the nightmare they envisioned, or would it crumble under the weight of its own power? One thing was certain: the journey had just begun, and the humans aboard the fallen star were ready to make their mark on the galaxy. They would prove that even the weakest ship could rise up and become the deadliest weapon in the fleet, and nothing would stand in their way. Growing suspicion. As the fallen star continued to improve, something unexpected began to happen. Whispers spread throughout the fleet. Rumors, vague and uncertain, started to surface about the ship's rapid transformation. What had once been considered a weak and outdated relic was now exhibiting signs of power that no one could ignore. But not everyone was impressed. Some were deeply suspicious. The fleet commanders, who had long written off the fallen star as a failure, began to notice the strange developments. The ship was no longer lagging behind. It was keeping pace, moving faster, and showing new capabilities that made even the most advanced ships in the fleet take notice. Some whispered that the humans had done the impossible. But were these improvements the result of luck, or was something more dangerous at play? Captain Lisa Harper and her crew worked tirelessly, trying to stay ahead of the growing suspicions. They knew that the more they improved the ship, the harder it would be to keep their efforts under wraps. Every upgrade seemed to draw more attention, and soon it wasn't just the fleet's engineers who were noticing. Senior officers began to question the ship's sudden surge in performance, and that meant trouble. Lieutenant General Aldous Kane, one of the fleet's most seasoned commanders, was the first to voice concerns. He had served in numerous battles and had seen his fair share of broken ships and failed upgrades, but the fallen star was different. Too different. He had seen the reports. The ship's weapons were now outperforming the fleet's best. Its engines had gained unprecedented efficiency, and its shields were much stronger than they had ever been. But more than that, there was an unsettling energy about the ship that nobody could explain. One evening, General Kane called a meeting with the fleet's top officers, including Commander Saris, a tactician known for his cold logic and skeptical mind. Kane's suspicions had grown so much that he demanded an inspection of the fallen star. If there was any chance the ship had become a threat, it was better to know now than later. Harper knew the inspection was coming. She had anticipated this moment, but even with all her preparations, she couldn't shake the feeling that this could be the end of her plans. She had spent so many months turning the ship into something no one could ever have imagined. And now it was being put to the test. Was she prepared for the consequences? The inspection team boarded the fallen star, walking through the now familiar corridors that had once felt so empty. Now the ship hummed with life, the pulse of its new systems resonating throughout its walls. Harper greeted the team at the entrance, doing her best to maintain her composure. She led them through the various sections of the ship, showcasing all the new upgrades, from the advanced engines to the newly installed weapon systems. She explained how each improvement had been carefully designed to optimize performance, ensuring the ship could hold its own in battle. But the team wasn't buying it. "Captain," General Kane said, his voice laced with doubt, "these systems don't just look new. They look alien. Some of this technology doesn't match anything we've seen in the fleet before. Where did you get it?" Harper's heart skipped a beat. She had anticipated questions about the ship's upgrades, but this level of scrutiny was more than she had hoped for. She had no choice but to lie. Telling them about the illegal scavenging trips to enemy territory was too risky, even if it had been their only option. Instead, she claimed that the technology came from salvaged materials, a mix of outdated human and alien tech. Saris, the cold tactician, wasn't convinced. He leaned in closer, his sharp eyes scanning the ship's inner workings as he spoke. "Captain, if you're telling the truth, then why does this ship feel different? It's as if the ship itself is responding to you, almost like it's alive." Harper swallowed hard. She knew exactly what he was talking about. The strange sensation that had begun to creep in, the feeling that the ship wasn't just a machine anymore, but something more. But she couldn't afford to let anyone know about it. The crew had already felt the ship's connection to them, the way its systems seemed to react more intuitively to their commands. But admitting this to the officers would be a grave mistake. They wouldn't understand. They might even see it as a threat. "I assure you, sir," Harper said, forcing herself to sound confident, "it's simply the result of our work and the new technology we've integrated. Nothing more." The officers exchanged uneasy glances, but they couldn't deny the improvements. The ship had become a force to be reckoned with. Still, suspicion hung in the air like a thick fog. The inspection team left with a mixture of disbelief and caution. They had seen the power of the fallen star, but they still didn't understand how it had happened or why it felt so strange. Despite the inspection's conclusion, the rumors continued to spread. The fleet commanders couldn't ignore the ship's success, but neither could they shake their growing fear. They had written off the fallen star as a lost cause, and now it had become the centerpiece of an unknown force, something that could either win them the war or destroy everything they had worked for. The tension between the fleet's leadership and the humans aboard the fallen star continued to grow. Would the fleet commanders accept the ship's newfound power, or would they attempt to shut it down before it became something even more dangerous? The fate of the fallen star hung in the balance, and as the ship's crew prepared for the next phase of their mission, they knew they were walking a fine line. But Harper and her team were determined. They had come too far to back down now. The ship was no longer just a tool. It had become their weapon, and they weren't going to let anyone take it from them. They had created something incredible, something that no one else could match. And soon, the galaxy would know the truth. The fallen star was no longer the weakest ship in the fleet. It was a nightmare waiting to be unleashed. The nightmare unleashed. The day had come. After months of secret upgrades, the fallen star was ready for its first real test in battle. The once-forgotten ship had become a force of destruction, its engines roaring with newfound power, its weapons fully equipped, and its shields as strong as any ship in the fleet. But with this strength came a terrifying realization. The fallen star wasn't just a tool. It had become something more, something that even its creators didn't fully understand. The human crew stood together on the bridge, watching as the enemy fleet approached. The coordinates had been given. A large battle group of alien ships was heading directly into their path. This was their moment. The fallen star had been designed for this very purpose, to strike fear into the hearts of the enemy, and prove that even the weakest could rise up to become a nightmare. Captain Lisa Harper stood at the helm, her heart pounding in her chest. She had worked relentlessly to get here, but now, as the enemy ships loomed closer, she couldn't help but feel a chill down her spine. This was no longer just about saving their ship. It was about proving that humanity could stand tall against the overwhelming forces of the galaxy. All systems online, the navigator confirmed. "We're ready, Captain." Harper nodded. "All hands, brace for impact. Let's show them what the fallen star can do." The ship's weapons powered up, and for a brief moment, the crew could feel the intense energy that surged through its hull. The air on the bridge crackled with tension as Harper issued the command to engage. The ship lurched forward, moving faster than it had ever been able to before, its engines roaring like a beast waking from slumber. The first few shots from the enemy fleet were easily deflected by the ship's new enhanced shields. The alien ships were quick to fire back, their weapons powerful, but no match for the ship's defenses. Harper watched the screen as the alien vessels took their positions, preparing for a full assault. But they had no idea what was about to hit them. Without warning, the fallen star unleashed its first salvo. The ship's new weapon systems fired in perfect sync, sending a torrent of deadly projectiles at the enemy ships. The blasts hit with such force that the enemy ships seemed to be torn apart before they even had a chance to retaliate. The crew stared in stunned silence as they watched the destruction unfold on the screen. Direct hits, multiple enemy ships destroyed. The weapons officer shouted in amazement, but Harper's focus never wavered. This was just the beginning. The enemy fleet, realizing they were up against something far more dangerous than they had anticipated, began to regroup, launching counterattacks. But the fallen star was no longer a target to be destroyed. It was a hunter. The ship dodged and weaved through enemy fire with precision that seemed almost impossible, its new systems making every maneuver feel effortless. The ship's hull absorbed hits that would have crippled any other vessel, and it returned fire with an unrelenting fury that no one in the enemy fleet had ever seen. As the battle raged on, the crew began to realize just how much the ship had changed. It was no longer just a machine. They had infused it with something more, something that made it feel alive. The way the ship responded to their commands, the way it seemed to anticipate the enemy's movements. It was as though the ship itself was an extension of the crew. They had created something extraordinary, something that no one could possibly predict. But amid the chaos, something unexpected happened. As the ship tore through the enemy fleet, a strange energy surge began to pulse through the ship's core. The lights flickered, the systems hummed with an unfamiliar rhythm, and Harper felt an eerie sensation creeping up her spine. The ship's responses were becoming erratic, too responsive, almost as if it had a mind of its own. "Captain, the ship is. It's not responding like it should," the weapons officer shouted. "There's a spike in power. It's off the charts." Harper's mind raced. Could the ship's systems have gone too far? She had been so focused on making the ship powerful, but now it seemed like something beyond her control was taking over. She had been warned about pushing the ship's limits, but now the reality of their creation was becoming clearer than ever. The ship was changing, evolving in ways that even she didn't fully understand. "Increase power to the main thrusters," Harper ordered, trying to maintain control. "We can't stop now. We have to finish this." But it was too late. The ship, as powerful as it was, had become unpredictable. The energy surge only grew stronger, and suddenly, the fallen star seemed to move of its own accord, tearing through enemy lines with terrifying precision. The weapons fired on their own, each shot devastating whatever it touched. The crew could only watch in stunned silence as their creation turned into a force of destruction, moving and firing like an unstoppable machine. The alien fleet began to break apart under the relentless assault, but the crew's victory felt hollow. They had won, yes, but at what cost? The ship had become a nightmare, not just for the enemy, but for its own crew as well. Harper stood on the bridge, watching as the final enemy ship was obliterated in a blinding explosion. The battle was over. They had succeeded. But the cost of this victory weighed heavily on her mind. What had they created? And could they control it before it spiraled out of control? The crew celebrated their hard-won victory. But deep down, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. The ship had changed, and not just in the way they had hoped. It had become something far more powerful and far more dangerous than they had ever anticipated. As the debris of the enemy fleet floated in the cold silence of space, the fallen star stood victorious. But it was clear that the ship's transformation had only just begun. What lay ahead for the crew was uncertain. Would they be able to control the nightmare they had unleashed, or would it consume them all? Only time would tell. The fleet's response. The aftermath of the battle was a strange silence. The crew of the fallen star stood in stunned awe as they surveyed the destruction around them. The enemy fleet was no more, scattered in the vast expanse of space like remnants of a forgotten dream. The ship had done what no one thought possible. It had obliterated an entire fleet with brutal efficiency. But as the silence stretched on, the crew couldn't escape the unsettling feeling that hung in the air. Harper stood at the helm, her hands gripping the controls as the ship's hum resonated beneath her. The crew had won, yes, but the victory felt incomplete. Her ship, had done more than they had ever imagined, but it had also become something they no longer fully understood. Its systems had evolved, reacting in ways that even the most advanced technology couldn't explain. The ship was no longer just a machine. It had become something else, something alive. "We did it, Captain," the navigator said, his voice shaky with both excitement and uncertainty. "We actually did it. The enemy never stood a chance." Harper nodded, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Her crew had fought bravely, and the ship had done its job, but now they had to face the consequences. They couldn't ignore the fact that the fallen star had become more powerful than anything the fleet had ever seen, and that power might be just as dangerous to them as it had been to the enemy. Suddenly, a transmission came through, a command from the fleet's central command. It was General Aldous Kane, the same officer who had once raised suspicions about the ship's upgrades. His voice crackled through the comms, filled with authority but tinged with apprehension. "Captain Harper, report to the command deck immediately. We need to discuss the ship's capabilities and its role in future operations." Harper's heart sank. She knew what this meant. The fleet commanders had been watching the battle, and now they were coming to terms with what the fallen star had become. They couldn't ignore it any longer. When Harper arrived at the fleet's command center, she was met with a mixture of stares, some curious, some fearful. General Kane stood at the front, flanked by Commander Saris and other high-ranking officers. Their eyes were locked on her, sizing her up, as though trying to figure out what had happened to the ship they had once written off as useless. "We've all seen the reports," General Kane said, his voice steady but with a hint of unease. "The ship's performance during the battle was nothing short of extraordinary. But we need to understand more about these upgrades. Where did this technology come from, Captain? How did you manage to turn the fallen star into a weapon of this magnitude?" Harper knew she couldn't be entirely truthful. The scavenging missions, the strange connection she and the crew felt with the ship, the alien technologies, she couldn't reveal everything. She'd already lied to them once, and she wasn't about to lose the ship over it. "We used a combination of salvaged materials and advanced engineering," Harper replied, trying to keep her voice calm. "The upgrades were risky, but we did what was necessary to ensure that the fallen star could fight. We didn't have a choice." Kane and the others exchanged skeptical glances. Commander Saris, ever the strategist, was the first to speak up. "And yet there's more to this than just engineering. The ship's systems, its behavior, it's almost as if it has a will of its own. Do you deny that, Captain?" Harper hesitated. She had felt it too. The way the ship responded almost instinctively to their commands, the way it had moved and fought with an intelligence that felt more organic than mechanical. But admitting it would mean risking everything. I don't know what you mean, Commander," she said, forcing a smile. "We've upgraded it to be more responsive, yes, but it's just a machine. It's nothing more than that." The officers weren't convinced. They could see the uncertainty in her eyes. It was clear that the fallen star was more than just a ship. It was something else entirely, something that even its creators couldn't fully understand or control. After a long pause, General Kane spoke again, his tone heavy. "We've been analyzing the data from the battle, Captain. The ship's performance was too perfect. It's too efficient. We've never seen anything like it before, and that worries me." Harper's mind raced. She could see where this was headed. The fleet didn't understand the ship, and fear was beginning to take root. The question was no longer whether the fallen star could be a weapon, but whether it could be controlled. "We need to decide what role this ship will play in future operations," Kane continued, his gaze narrowing. "We need to decide whether it's an asset or a liability. Because if it's the latter, we may have no choice but to shut it down." The words hit Harper like a cold slap. She had worked so hard, had taken so many risks, and now the very thing she had created was being questioned. But there was no turning back now. The fallen star was too powerful. It had become the fleet's strongest asset, and Harper would do whatever it took to keep it in their hands. "You can't shut it down, General," she said, her voice firm. "We've only just begun to realize the potential of this ship. It can win this war. It can turn the tide in our favor. We can't waste this opportunity." Kane's eyes flashed with irritation, but he said nothing for a moment. Finally, he spoke, his voice low but resolute. "We'll discuss this further, Captain. But know this, the future of the fallen star will not be decided by one person. It will be a decision made by the fleet, by all of us, and the fate of this ship will determine the fate of the war." As Harper turned to leave the command center, her mind was clouded with uncertainty. She had won a battle, but now the real war was just beginning. The fleet was divided, and the fallen star had become the center of that conflict. Would they accept it as a weapon of unimaginable power, or would they shut it down before it became too dangerous? Harper didn't know the answer. All she knew was that the ship had given them a chance, and she would fight to keep that chance alive. The nightmare they had unleashed was far from over, and neither the fleet nor the galaxy would ever be the same again. The final decision. The debate over the fate of the fallen star raged on in the fleet's command center. Harper had made her case, but she wasn't sure if it would be enough. General Kane and the high-ranking officers were divided. Some believed that the ship's newfound power could turn the tide of the war, but others feared what it could mean for the future. The potential for destruction was immense, and not everyone was convinced the humans had control over the ship's evolution. As the crew of the fallen star awaited the decision, Harper couldn't help but feel the weight of the situation. She had built the ship into something extraordinary, but now it seemed like the very thing they had created might tear them apart. The officers, filled with suspicion and fear, were growing increasingly hesitant, and time was running out. Harper sat in her quarters, staring out at the stars, trying to collect her thoughts. The voices of doubt and fear echoed in her mind, but she refused to give in. The ship was their only chance. It was too powerful, too dangerous, and they couldn't let that power slip away. The war had been raging for too long, and the fate of humanity rested on their shoulders. The fallen star could be the weapon that brought victory, or it could be the very thing that ended it all. But just as Harper was about to give up hope, a message came through. An emergency transmission from an Allied fleet that was under attack by a massive enemy force. The situation was dire. The enemy had brought reinforcements, and the fleet was on the brink of destruction. Their only hope was the fallen star. The message was a clear call to action. There was no more time for debate. The fleet had to act. Harper quickly gathered her crew and rushed to the bridge. The ship's systems hummed with life, almost as if it was ready for battle before she even gave the order. As the crew prepared for the mission, Harper couldn't help but feel that the ship had become more than just a weapon. It had become a symbol of hope, a beacon in the darkness of the war. "We're heading to the coordinates," Harper announced as the ship's engines roared to life. "This is our chance to prove that we can control the fallen star. We're not backing down." The crew worked in unison, navigating the ship through hyperspace toward the battleground. As they neared the enemy's position, the enormity of the task ahead became clear. The enemy fleet was vast, far larger than anything they had faced before, but Harper knew they had no choice. This was the moment that would determine the future of the fallen star and its crew. When the fallen star arrived at the battlefield, the enemy ships immediately targeted them. But this time, it was different. The ship responded instantly to the crew's commands, its weapons firing with deadly accuracy. The newly upgraded systems activated seamlessly, launching barrages of energy blasts and missile strikes at the enemy fleet. The crew's tactics were now perfectly synchronized with the ship's new capabilities, creating an overwhelming force that tore through the enemy ranks. However, as the battle progressed, Harper's concerns began to surface again. The ship was responding faster than she had anticipated, its systems moving in sync with the crew, but also with a strange intelligence of their own. The ship felt like it was thinking, almost as though it was making its own decisions. "Captain, we're losing control of the firing systems," the weapons officer yelled. "The ship's targeting is locking onto secondary enemies without commands." Harper's heart raced. The ship had always seemed to have a mind of its own, but now it was becoming too much. It was as if the fallen star was no longer just a vessel, but a living entity, thinking and acting independently. Yet there was no turning back. The ship was unstoppable, and they were in the middle of the largest battle the fleet had ever faced. "We have to finish this now," Harper shouted over the comms, trying to regain control of the situation. "Keep firing. Stay focused. We can't let it take over." As the battle reached its climax, the fallen star tore through the enemy's defenses with a savage precision that left no doubt. It was a weapon like no other. The enemy fleet, once confident in their numbers, began to crumble under the relentless assault. The tide had turned in the humans' favor, and the fallen star was the key to that victory. The last of the enemy ships exploded in a fiery blaze as the crew stood in awe. The battle was over. The enemy had been defeated. But even as the crew celebrated their victory, Harper couldn't shake the feeling that the fallen star was becoming something beyond their control. In the aftermath, General Kane contacted Harper, his voice stern, but with a note of respect. "Captain Harper," he began, "we've seen what the fallen star is capable of. It's not just a ship, it's a force of nature. You've proven that you can control it, but now we need to make a decision. The fleet is divided, and we cannot afford to have a ship that operates beyond our control. We will either integrate the fallen star fully into our forces, or we will shut it down." Harper stood in silence for a moment, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had fought for the fallen star, had given everything to bring it to this point. But now, she had to decide its future. And with that decision, she would shape the future of the war, the fleet, and humanity itself. After a long pause, Harper spoke, her voice steady but filled with determination. "We will integrate it," she said. "We have to trust in what we've created. The fallen star is more than just a ship. It's humanity's future. We'll control it, and we'll use it to win this war." And with that, the fallen star became the most powerful weapon in the galaxy. Its journey had only just begun. As the fleet moved forward into the heart of the enemy's territory, Harper knew that the ship and humanity would face challenges greater than anything they had encountered before. But with the fallen star at their side, they were no longer the weakest link. They were unstoppable. The nightmare had been unleashed, and now the galaxy would tremble at the power of humanity's greatest creation.